channel. Today I'm here to talk to you about all the books I read during March and do the March wrap up. Basically this month I read 5 traditionally published books and 3 books that I think are indie, and all of them were sent to me for an honest review. So basically all 3 of them were ARCs, Advanced Reader Copies. Notably, it was also a very interesting month in that I had some YA books, some YA fantasy books, some urban fantasy and romance fantasy, so I had something for everybody, for every taste in this month. The first book I'm going to talk about is Burn For Me by Ilona Andrews. This is a writing duo, a husband and a wife, that are writing urban fantasy novels, and this was no exception. This was the first in a series that I haven't read before, obviously. Burn For Me was the first book I read from this writing duo. I can say that it was good, nothing too exciting. It was about a young detective that got in the middle of finding a dangerous person whose family was seeking him out, and she was basically blackmailed into looking for him. She didn't really want to, she didn't have any interest into it, but she did it anyway because otherwise she would lose her firm. And then she also got in the middle of someone else trying to find this person. The action just escalated from there. It was a good read, it was a solid read. It was a basic urban fantasy story with lots of battles taking place throughout the city. This is also taking place in the future. It doesn't affect the story as much as I would have thought if I read about it before going into the story. But basically, if I wasn't interested in reading any more series by this author duo, I don't know if I would have continued. I'm not inclined to continue with this series because I didn't enjoy it as much as I would have thought I would. I liked the premise, and up to a point I really enjoyed it, but then the male protagonist was a little bit too assumptuous, let's say. He was taking liberties when the female protagonist obviously told him not to. This didn't sit very well with me, so I don't think I'm going to continue with this series. But I am still interested to check out the rest of the Ilona Andrews series, most importantly Kate Daniels, or the Clean Sweep, is that what it's called? So I'll probably tell you my thoughts about this series another time. The next book I read, I also have filmed a reading vlog about, but it's not going to go up yet because I have another reading vlog that will be prioritized, but keep an eye out for that anyway. And it is One of Us is Lying by Karen M. McManus. This is a YA thriller and mystery book. 5 students get into detention and only 4 walk out alive. And then the story escalates from there, with the 4 students being on the forefront as suspects, and then we get closer to finding out what really happened and what happened behind this death. It was a very enjoyable read, but I felt like in the middle it was a little bit slower, and we only started trying to find out what really happened with that death, which was very mysterious to begin with, and everybody should have looked into it before the last point. But that is exactly what happened. Only in I think in the last fourth of the book, people started wondering about it and started looking more into it. Before that, everybody was just focusing on the 4 suspects. Mainly before that point, when the investigation really started, I was more inclined to read this about the little YA romance that was taking place, and it was very exciting. And then the epilogue also sparked an interest in me to continue with the series. I had loaned the second book from the library as well, but I had to return it because I was running out of time, and I didn't want to start it immediately after the first book because I wasn't all that interested in it, in this story. So maybe in the future I will loan it back. Then I participated in the Trans Rights Readathon, and I read 2 books during the course of that readathon. The first book I read was Felix Ever After by Casey Callender. This is a YA coming-of-age, own voices novel about a trans boy that is trying to find his identity in the midst of lots of drama going on, lots of traumatic experiences and homophobia, transphobia. It was like the teenage experience, but from the lens of a trans person that is also trying to find their own identity and who they really are. A very enjoyable read, a really powerful read as well. It made me really think about some things that I wouldn't have thought about if I hadn't read that novel. I also enjoyed Case and Calendar's writing very much, and I have my eye also on other books by this author. The second book I read for this readathon was Read by Akwati Emezi. This was also a book about a trans character, a girl this time, that is living in the future in a world where monsters used to be like regular people that did monstrous things, and now she's living in a utopia where the monsters have been destroyed until a monster-looking thing pops out of a painting, and they start to look for the monster it is going to hunt for. This was also a very powerful read, and it emphasized the fact that monsters are humans, and whatever has a monstrous form isn't necessarily a monster, but their actions would make it a monster. I don't know if it makes sense, but I really like the message it conveyed. It reaches a middle grade, but it also has some heavier topics that might not be for everybody, for every child. I know for sure that I wouldn't read this if I was a child. I think it was very powerful for me because I read it now. And then I'm going to talk about the 3 arcs I read. The first was Starseed by Olivia Hillier. This was sent to me by the author for an honest review, and I've got to say it was a very interesting read. It also had this element of monster-like shadows that go around people who have darkness within their heart and their minds. It was a very interesting premise. It was a really short story though, or at least it felt short to me. It was written for a younger audience though. It was very obvious that it was directed at a younger audience, so I didn't enjoy it as much. I liked the messages it conveyed, but I did feel like some of the situations and some of the conversations were a bit unrealistic. And I forgot to mention what this book is about. Basically, it is about a young girl that is able to see shadows, and when these shadows become too much, she has to act on it. But when she acted on it, everybody thought she was crazy. And she started getting help from psychiatrists and receiving medication for schizophrenia. Then she went to a new town. She moved there with her mother. The story unfolds from there. I'm not sure if I should say what's happening because it was a surprise for me. She basically stops her medication on her own. Things just escalate from there. Lots of things are happening. As a mental health professional, I was a little bit uncomfortable with some of the schizophrenia mentions in this book and the way they were discussed about by the characters. That's also another point why I didn't really enjoy this book. But anyway, the next arc I read was A Court is Cruel and Lovely by Stacia Stark, and I have to say that if I have a favorite book of this month, this would be it. I read it so quickly because I had to review it by a due deadline and I was already behind. I did review it 4 days after the review was due. If I could, I would read it even slower because I wanted to actually read every single sentence so carefully and absorb every detail of this world. I don't know why. Maybe it was the writing, because this was a typical romance fantasy book, but it was written so well. It had an enemies to lovers romance, but it was executed so nicely with a slow burn. It didn't feel rushed at all. The heroine was very brave and she clearly had a character growth. But let me start from the beginning, from where the book started. In this world, there are people who have powers. I think maybe everybody has power. When they are little babies, there's a ceremony that takes this power away from them and they get it back when they are 25. But there are some people that have this power, and our heroine is one of them, before they're 25, which is illegal, and if the authorities find out, basically they kill everybody in your family in front of you. And of course they imprison you to execute you at a later point as well. So our heroine, to avoid this, she basically runs away from her house, and so many things happen after that. She travels in the woods, then she ends up in a different place, and then there are reveals, and everything is so transportive. I don't know if it was the writing style or the story that made me so immersed, but I felt like I wanted to be there for every step of the way. I liked that there were at some points POVs from the male interest as well, the romantic interest, and they only served to make me even more immersed in the story. As I said, there was a definite character growth for our heroine. She became from a typical 20-something girl that ran to save her life to a very grown-up woman basically that took initiatives and thought about strategies on how to save the people. I like this book very much, and I'm definitely going to continue with the series, as well as keep an eye out for all of Stacia Stark's past and future releases, because I'm obsessed with her writing at this point. I don't know how that happened, but I'm very, very happy every time this happens. Moving on to the next arc I read during the month of March, and it was Love Beneath by Deza Clare. This is the first installment of a new series by this author. It is the FBI series, and this is basically why I chose this arc to review, because it has FBI, the same more. However, it was a very short novel. It is about an FBI agent. When she was very small, her fair mother was murdered in a very peculiar way. And now as an FBI agent, she needs to solve a murder that is very similar to how her mother died. And she has to uncover a whole secret organization going on behind the scenes. It honestly sounds so interesting, but it was so rushed. It was like a novella, barely 100 pages. I didn't feel like the heroine was fleshed out, the romance wasn't fleshed out, it was purely insta-love. The first sentences the male romantic interest said were like flirtations, but very forward, too forward for someone you just met. It felt too rushed, too quick, completely unrealistic. I felt like I was reading a very rough first draft of the book and not the fleshed out story. And it's a pity because it is a story that I could have liked very much. In some chapters, the writing was so slow. Not slow exactly, but slower than the rest of the story. And it was taking its time, describing what the heroine was feeling and the dreams he had. And it felt so realistic, and then bam, after a few paragraphs we were back to fast-paced and completely unrealistic action sequences and romantic sequences that didn't make any sense basically. Anyway, and moving on to the last book I read, one of the most exciting reads of this month as well, because it took me closer to finishing a series I have longed to finish for a while now, and this is Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare, the first book in the Infernal Devices series. This is a very interesting read for me because I'm also currently filming a reading vlog where I read all the books in the series back to back. I binge read the whole series, which usually doesn't work for me, but for these books it works. I don't know how or why, but it does. So as I said, this is the first book in this series. This is a very well-known series, but if you don't know, it follows Tessa, a young girl that receives a letter from her brother. She lived in New York, and when we start this book, she's traveling from New York to London to meet her brother, but then on the way there, she is basically kidnapped by two very strange women that force her to develop a power that she never knew she had. And then we also get to know the shadow hunters of London of the 1800s, and Will and Jem and Charlotte and everybody in this book. This was a reread for me, so I knew how the story would unfold. I remembered the ending because it was such a huge plot twist for me the first time I read it. So if I remembered anything about this book, it was the ending. But I loved all the way up to that ending, because knowing how the book would end helped me, see glimpses of it during the book and how everybody was behaving. It was a very interesting read for me. I enjoyed it very much. Cassandra Clare's writing is very transportive. It made me feel like I was also in the 1800s London, and I was walking with the characters through all these famous landmarks, but back then when it was gloomy and foggy all the time, I don't know, I enjoyed this read so much. I'm also reading right now Clockwork Prince. I'm halfway there, but during March I had read only the first few. Today is the 2nd of March, if you're wondering. So I have made quite a lot of progress, and this is also a reread. I'm not going to talk about this book, but I'm carrying it over to April. That's why I wanted to mention it very briefly. That's all the books I read during March. It was a very productive month. I can say that I read most of them during the end of the month because the first half of the month was very busy for me. Please let me know in the comments below which books of these have you read, which books you are excited about, what you read during this month, and what was your favorite book of the month, because I would like to check it out as well. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video. Bye bye.